So my talk is a little bit outside the norm here in comparison to the previous panelists, but it still addresses something that I think is underlying just about everything that we've talked about so far today. That is, how do we actually handle training the athletes and the performers themselves? So much of what we love about sports is watching people perform at the limits of what we think, a human is capable of. So how do we actually prepare people for these moments, and how do we then translate that same preparation into everyday lives and workplaces? So my background is in neuroscience. My PhD is focused on how the brain creates emotion and how we regulate emotion under a variety of circumstances. So for most people, though, emotion is kind of a dirty word. Most people are taught to suppress negative emotions, to embrace positive emotions as much as possible, and to fight against discomfort. But what you see is that the people who are able to perform at the highest levels are those who actually can embrace performance at the very limits. This is the topic that we're most interested in at the USC Peak Performance and Performance Science Institute. We're interested in how do people actually perform, and what actually makes people tick, and what are the techniques that we can then train. We're interested in people like this. This is Alex Honnold. For those of you who don't know, Alex was recently the first person, and probably going to be the only person for many years, to free solo El Capitan in Yosemite. Free soloing means climbing without any ropes or aid of any kind. Here he is on a similar route, an overhanging route. He's probably about 1,000 feet off the ground here, just basics, just working with his own ability to remain calm in the situation. So Alex himself has some extremely interesting emotion regulation abilities. He talks a lot about fear as being critical to his success. This is, again, contrary to how most people think about negative emotion. When most people think about negative emotion, it's something to be fought against, whereas the people who actually are performing at the highest level take the viewpoint that emotion is mandatory for good performance. Alex breaks up his performance in terms of fear and risk and consequence. Here he knows that the consequence is quite high, but he feels that the risk is indeed quite low because he knows he won't ever fall on this route, or that's what his training has led him to believe. So for him, regulating that emotion comes down to understanding and breaking apart the different feelings related to the challenges that he faces. And indeed, when people scan brains like Alex, you actually can see differences in the fear circuitry in terms of how people like Alex might actually process fearful stimuli in a completely different way compared to control everyday people. In this image you can see, which is a little bit difficult to understand if you're not used to looking at brain images, but situated here at the crosshairs is a part of the brain known as the amygdala, which is a critical part of the brain for salience processing. It's not necessarily for fear, but it's for understanding and guiding yourself through novel situations that include fear, of course. But how we regulate activity in regions like the amygdala determines so much about how we can perform. And here we see that somebody like Alex has a fundamental different pattern of brain activity compared to healthy controls. So emotion then is critical for decision making. And what's fun about emotion, when we start playing with these terms like emotion and feeling and mind, what it gives us is just a toolkit for treating our life as a laboratory. As we train our students and soon-to-be business leaders, we like to think of every day as just a chance to run an experiment. In our case, emotion is the byproduct of good experimentation, and it's important for decision making. We also know that the brain anatomy for decision making, insofar as it's related to emotion, is actually rooted in emotion itself and not logic. So decision making is part emotion, part logic. And finally, we have now tools related to how we train our minds such that we can take advantage of emotion and health regulation strategies. So what we have are the ingredients for performance that relate to the challenges we face in the world, but also our emotions that can arise as we face these challenges. And then we have our mind, which is the ability to regulate and change how we perceive these things. What's interesting to me as a neuroscientist is that the closer we get to the actual brain anatomy for decision making, the closer we get to seeing that when people are making improper decisions, usually the part of it that is missing is the emotion component. So people with lesions to a specific part of the brain, namely the prefrontal cortex or the medial prefrontal cortex, are actually unable to develop the proper stress response for stressful decision making. And as a result, their even most basic decision making abilities go out the window. So when people say don't get emotional, they're not just inaccurate, they are actually wrong. So emotion and reason have to work together at all times, and this is what you see in the highest level athletes. Here's some interesting examples from research that shows some of the ways that emotion and emotion regulation can play into our performance. So in this very simple experiment, people were induced to feel happiness, anger, anxiety, or sadness. And then we're asked to perform a set of physical tasks, very simple tasks like jumping and throwing a ball. So in the physical tasks, anger and happiness were both better than anxiety and sadness for performance. And doesn't this fit so well with our what we hear from elite athletes in terms of what motivates them to perform? So Kobe Bryant often talks about being motivated by hatred, by this extreme competitive urge. And in fact, that ability to induce that emotion, even something like anger, which we normally think of as very maladaptive, can actually increase performance across a number of domains. What I think is so interesting in this experiment is that happiness was comparable to anger. And you will see that also in sports performers where they talk about the need to recall a specific memory or a family member that they play for. How often have you heard after a game football players recalling, I was here for my grandma, she raised me, and that's a form of gratitude which is related to happiness that can actually promote good pro-social behavior, but also increased physical performance. I hope that at this point we're uncovering the message that emotion and performance go together in really interesting ways. And then when we understand emotion, we can begin to play with it. So this example, and I'm sorry for the fairly confusing graph, but focus on the top line in panel B. Can you guys see my mouse cursor by chance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, okay, good. So just focus on these three little diamonds over here. So don't worry too much about any of the rest of this. Just notice that these three little diamonds are higher than the rest of this noise. This is the result of an experiment in which people were asked to make very simple decision-making over time, basically just playing a very simple card game. And what they found is that if they put people in a negative mood and then had them either reappraise, suppress, or do nothing with the mood, their performance changed as a result. So people who were taught to reappraise the negative mood, such as saying, well, sadness is just part of life, it's part of how we grow, how we understand things, so feeling sadness is actually okay. Reappraising that negative emotion actually led to just better decision making. That is in a very simple game where you're asked to just turn over cards to try to make the most money. Reappraising a negative emotion was actually associated with much higher performance overall than those who were taught to just suppress their negative emotion. Suppression is one of our common coping strategies, which is that when you're feeling bad, you're hurt, you're told to just suck it up, to deal with it, to ignore it. And in fact, in the most basic decision-making tasks, suppressing negative emotion is associated with a strong decline in performance compared to actually working with emotion in a skillful manner. Again, this is in the most basic decision-making task, and you see this in sports performers who can handle the pressure. Maybe you're down in the fourth quarter and you need to get better. Maybe you're accelerating and you need to keep your competitive edge. But in all cases, our ability and our skill for regulating emotion determines so much of our performance. So the hope is that by training people in how to perform better, we can thus see, or training people to understand emotion more carefully, that their performance will increase as well. In this example, we have elite cyclists, and we're measuring the amount of oxygen that they're consuming over time. And we put them into one of two emotions. One is an unpleasant emotion, and one is a positive emotion. And given that the skill parameter, the skills between these cyclists were, in fact, very similar, we see that people in the unpleasant emotion actually used much more oxygen over the time span of the workout compared to those in the positive emotion. I think results like this are so interesting. For one thing, because emotion is meant as part of our biological systems for health and well-being. Emotion is central to our evolution and it's central to our species. So why don't we use it more carefully? Experiments like this demonstrate that the ability to evoke a positive emotion saves a little bit of wear and tear on our body. The ability to uncork and understand that emotion is a natural process associated with performance and stress allows us to increase our abilities overall. So there are all kinds of studies that show that our mindset for thinking about emotion and feeling predicts so much about how we do, and yet so little time is spent actually training the mind. So that's what we're all about. At our institute, we host a minor and a class. So this is a flyer, this is a little commercial for our class called The Science of Peak Performance, and I encourage anybody here to drop in. It's on Monday nights here at USC. And we actually, of course, lectures on these exact topics. You draw from my experience as a neuroscientist. We bring in scholars, and we bring in coaches like Pete Carroll. We bring in entrepreneurs to talk about the challenges they've faced, and we deliver these to undergraduates to help them perform in their lives. And this class is now the second largest class at the USC Marshall School of Business, or the second largest elective. And we've been so heartened by the response that we've had from students. It's been great. We also have a minor in performance science at USC that takes the best classes around USC and puts them together so students can study mind, body, business. They learn a little bit about a psychology, a little bit of biology, and a little bit of entrepreneurship. Because entrepreneurs and business people, we face so many of the same challenges that athletes face. And we believe that by training entrepreneurs and business people the same way we train elite athletes, we'll see better, more compassionate, more interesting, and more creative business ventures overall. We've had great luck training our students so far, and we're just beginning. We just launched the Institute, which is now called the Performance Science Institute, just basically a few months ago with a kickoff event with Brene Brown, who's an expert in vulnerability. We also have Alex coming on January 31st. He's going to be interviewed by myself and Michael Gervais, who's a big performance psychologist as well. And I'm going to leave us with, since I'm the last panelist, I feel like I have the chance to leave us with a little bit of Tuesday advice for us. Alex tells us, choose the thing that inspires you and go out and try. If anything, the bigger and more grand it seems, the better. If you're like, oh, I could never do that, that's too much, it probably means that that's the right thing for you, that you're on the right track. So this is Alex's little clue for how he regulates emotion. And I look forward to your questions, and I'm honored to be a part of the panel. Thank you very much.